Hello amazing students! The purpose of this video tutorial is to explain and explore visual text analysis as it relates to subject English. We're going to be focusing a lot on the meta-language that is used in visual text analysis, as it's quite different to the meta-language we usually use to analyse written texts. Let's define a few of these words before we go any further. Meta-language is a form of language or set of terms used for the description or analysis of language. By language, we mean a system of commonly understood spoken, manual, visual, or written symbols that humans use to communicate with one another. In subject English, the term language mainly refers to written language and visual language. Visual elements and visual conventions are how we talk about and understand visual language. Visual conventions are the visual language elements which all work together to convey ideas or to convey meaning in images. Now that we've defined those terms, let's have a look at the framework we use to analyse visual texts. A framework is basically a system of support. So this framework here is what will support or underpin your analysis of visual texts. It will also give you a clear strategy to approach visual text with, whilst also showing you how to use the applicable meta-language. For the purpose of analysis, we can divide the conventions associated with visual texts into two main groups. Those associated with what we can see in the image, which is referred to as the content, and the visual conventions which are associated with how we see the image. And this is called the technical construction. It's useful to remember that the framework we use for analysis can be divided up into lots of 2 and 4. This little memory trick will help you to remember all of the different elements and meta-language. Now let's explore these two groups of conventions from our framework in a little bit more detail. We're going to start with content. This group can be broken up into 4 categories: people, places, objects, and animals. When people appear in images, it's always important to consider the following aspects: their occupation or their role, their nationality and their ethnicity, what they're wearing, their physical appearance, and whether or not there is anything significant about their physical appearance, their body language, and their facial expression. Also, people that appear in images fall into one of 2 subcategories: specific or generic. Basically, a specific person is someone who is easily recognisable and can be identified by name. The example I've included on this slide is Donald Trump. In contrast, a generic person in an image is not somebody in the public eye and who is therefore not instantly recognisable. Instead, they may be a generalised representation of a group or section of people in society, such as a professional, an adolescent, or an older person, or perhaps something about their appearance or position in the image may be used to suggest an idea or some kind of meaning. The example that I've included here is of a man in a white lab coat with a stethoscope around his neck. His clothing, the stethoscope prop, and his general clean-cut appearance all suggest that he's a medical professional of some kind. So even though he's not a specific person that we can identify or name, we can still get a lot of information about him and what ideas he represents from all of these different visual elements. Moving on to places now, you'll notice that this category is also split into generic and specific subcategories. Similar to specific people, specific places are actual identifiable places on Earth, while generic places are general settings. The picture on the left here is of a generic setting, an unidentifiable beach, while the example on the right is of a specific setting, which is easily identifiable as Sydney due to the Sydney Opera House. Finally, looking at our last categories of content, objects and animals, the importance of symbolism in the analysis of visual texts becomes very apparent. Symbols basically convey abstract notions, ideas, or deeper meanings, all of which are created through the connotations or the ideas that we associate with specific objects, settings, people, or animals. Looking at the three examples I've included here, the literal interpretation is that they're pictures of a gun, a crow, and a rose. However, if we consider them symbolically, it can be suggested that the gun and the crow symbolize violence, darkness, and perhaps death, and that the rose could symbolize or suggest romance and love, or perhaps beauty, depending on the context and what else is included in the image. The main thing to remember with this whole group of visual conventions is that the effect of people, places, objects, and animals in visual texts often relies on connotation, symbolism, and context to create meaning. Let's now move on to the next group of visual conventions, which are those that are associated with the technical construction of visual texts. This group can also be broken up into 4 categories: viewer perspective, composition, leading lines, and lighting and colour. As we did with the differing categories of content, we're now going to run through each of the elements of technical construction in more detail, starting with viewer perspective. Viewer perspective refers to the way an image is constructed so that the viewer seems to be observing the subject or subjects of the image in certain ways. Aspects of viewer perspective include viewing angle, viewing distance, framing, and focus. In the case of photography and live cinematography, viewing angle is often referred to as camera angle, but artwork and animation can also create a viewing angle. Some examples of viewing angle are high angle, eye level angle, low angle, aerial angle, and oblique angle. An oblique angle is where the orientation of an image is off of the horizontal. This perspective is often used to create a sense of mental disorientation or distress in the subject. Similarly, high angles tend to make a subject seem less important or less powerful, while low angles tend to make the subject seem more powerful, important, or perhaps even threatening. Moving on to viewing distance, this refers to the distance that the viewer seems to be from the subject. In photography, common terms used to describe viewing distance are close-up, medium shot, and long shot. It is important also to remember that these terms are relative. There are also extreme close-ups and extreme long shots. Again, the same effects can be presented in animation and in artwork. Close-ups tend to create a greater sense of intimacy between viewer and subject, while long shots tend to create a greater sense of psychic or emotional distance, often focusing our attention on the subject's relationship with their environment instead. Looking at framing, framing is partly a function of viewing distance. It refers to the frame around the image of a subject and affects what the viewer sees and does not see. Framing can sometimes have the effect of making the viewer aware of things that the subject is not aware of. Framing can also be used so that it appears we are looking over the shoulder of someone and thus sharing their perspective. Finally, focus is a way of conferring importance. Clearly, the parts of an image that are in focus are the ones that the viewer is positioned to see as most important. Those parts of the image that are out of focus are ones that we are positioned to see of some importance, because otherwise they wouldn't be included in the image, but of less importance than the things that are in focus. Focus can also be a means of establishing mystery or suspense. Looking now at composition. Composition basically refers to how the elements of an image are arranged and is sometimes referred to as mise en scène. Two important aspects of composition are foregrounding and backgrounding, and centering and marginalisation. Objects that are foregrounded and centred appear more important or powerful than those that are in the background or towards the edge of the frame or that are marginalised. Another aspect of composition is the size of particular visual elements in relation to others and in relation to the frame of the image. Larger objects tend to be of more central importance, while smaller objects are seen to be of marginal importance. Another aspect of the composition of a visual image is the use of the rule of thirds. Photographers and filmmakers are taught to think of an image as consisting of 3 equally spaced horizontal bands and 3 equally spaced vertical bands. So the image consists of 9 parts, as in this example down here. The main points of interest in an image should be placed along one of the bands or on one of the intersection points, as the human eye is naturally drawn to these. So creators of visual text can use the rule of thirds to create emphasis and to convey a sense of importance about a particular element of the image. Leading lines are our third element of technical construction and refers to lines that lead the eyes of the viewer in a particular direction, perhaps to the salient feature of the image. Thus, leading lines are a means of creating emphasis and positioning the reader to see a subject in a certain way. Leading lines can be created through natural features, physical objects, gestures, eye lines, and light, among other things. Finally, we have lighting and colour. Lighting, including the use of shadows, can play an important role in creating atmosphere and in highlighting or downplaying certain elements of an image. Colours are often used to evoke emotion or to help associate certain ideas or feelings with the subject or subjects in an image. In this still from the film Gattaca, which came out in 1997, the low lighting and the muted coal blue-grey colour palette suggest the conformity, sterility, and lack of vibrance within the society that is depicted in the film. However, the use of the light to highlight the face of Vincent Freeman, played by Ethan Hawke, suggests that he is not psychologically a part of this world. The last thing to remember about this group of visual conventions is that not all of these elements of technical construction are going to be vitally important to every visual text. A huge part of visual text analysis is actually being able to distinguish which elements are important in constructing meaning. Now that we've had a closer look at our two groups of visual conventions, let's bring it all together by having a look at an example. This photograph here was taken in 1967 by a photographer named Mark Ribau. It's of a young American girl named Jan Rose Kashmir, and it shows her confronting the American National Guard outside of the Pentagon during the 1967 anti-Vietnam War March. This particular march really helped to turn the public opinion against the war in Vietnam. This image really works on a number of levels. Kashmir is confronting the line of National Guardsmen with their rifles at the ready and with their bayonets fixed. The photographer has set his camera so that there is a narrow depth of field, meaning that the background is a blur, leaving just Kashmir and the end of the first rifle in focus. This positions the viewer to focus on the sharp contrast or the juxtaposition between the peaceful symbolism of the flower in Kashmir's hand, held almost as some kind of peace offering, against the rigid violence symbolised by the rifle. An understanding of the context of this image yields another layer of meaning. In 1967, America was really torn over the conflict in Vietnam. Young people were protesting in a way that many of their elders perceived as anarchic and even treasonous. It's easy to see in this image the symbolism of the individual against the establishment. But having said that, I can't help but sympathise with the National Guardsmen. They are under orders to preserve the peace, but they have not been trained in the same way as police. The men in uniform didn't necessarily want this situation to turn to violence. This leads me to consider this as an image of America's social and political implosion that occurred in the 1960s. The construction of the image makes the weapon seem almost ludicrous. Kashmir is confronting the military might of the United States government with nothing more than a flower. The notion of flower power, which held significance among the countercultural movements of the period, becomes really central here. The image positions us to see the flower as being more powerful than the gun. We've now reached the end of this tutorial, which I hope has been helpful. Remember that visual analysis is a skill, and that just like with any other skill, it's important to practice and to revise the metalanguage. Well done for making it this far. You were all super brilliant, and I know that you're all going to do really well the next time you need to analyse a visual text.